You're listening to On the Margins with me, Dan O'Sullivan.
And me, Eamon Stack-Mulvihill.
In this podcast, we'll examine sites of education which are off the beaten track. Non-traditional, non-typical, but diverse and exceptional. Looking at learners who are often marginalised and ignored. Okay, we are delighted to have Dr. Sadhbh O'Dwyer here today. And Sadhbh is an expert in special educational needs and inclusion. But before we even get there, I got an email from you, Sadhbh, saying you wanted to put a bigger kind of slant on neurodiversity.
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm always wary if somebody says I'm an expert. I always worry about being an expert. So I would say I'm somebody with an interest and kind of research and kind of professional and lived experience of neurodiversity and maybe promoting more inclusive approaches to education. So that's be where I'd be at.
Okay, perfect. And can you tell us a little bit about your journey into the field of special educational needs and what inspired you to focus on this area?
So I suppose a lot of my training was in the UK, and I did an MSc in education, and the focus was specific learning difficulties. They call them SPLIDs, which sounds like you have a bit of a cold, so I don't like to say that because it sounds really weird. So specific learning difficulties, that's associated with neurodiversity, and that's typically working with people who might be dyslexic, autistic, who may have ADHD, anything that, the more traditional modes of learning consider a difficulty. Now, I myself am dyspraxic. I discovered I was dyspraxic while training to do assessments on dyspraxic people. I couldn't do the tests myself, and I thought, maybe this explains why I failed my driving test 8 times. But like a lot of kind of late diagnosed people, I have children who are neurodivergent. And it often happens that, children might go through the process now and get diagnosed as having ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia. And then the parents go, that speaks to me too, and that might explain why I couldn't do Irish dancing and why I was permanently stuck in the easy reel for 6 years. But by the end of those 6 years, I was an excellent easy reel dancer, but it took me a while. So I got interested in this because I was working in the UK with students with mental health needs. And what I discovered was that so many of these students had undiagnosed neurodiversities. Lots of these were women in particular with undiagnosed ADHD and dyslexia. And there's a lot more knowledge about this now, but 10 years ago that still wasn't the case. People thought these women were just being awkward or being difficult. And I had a path worn down to the dyslexia and ADHD services in the university I was working at. And they said to me, well, if you're so interested in this, would you ever go away and retrain? So I did. And my specific kind of interest is in working with people with dyslexia and ADHD and dyspraxia. So because I'm a little bit extra, I then decided to do a PhD in it as well, because I was kind of annoyed at the training that teachers get on this. And my own kind of specific PhD was on using maybe more social justice approaches to understand neurodiversity. And that's a lot of things that teachers don't really get trained on. And that's something that I feel very strongly about. Then I got the opportunity to work in the School of Education here, and you two fine gentlemen are great representatives of the School of Education in UL. And I felt it was very important that teachers get an understanding of what neurodiversity is, not just understanding it as challenges that people can have, but also understanding the different approaches that you can bring as both a teacher and a learner. So that's, I suppose, my background. It's very much personal, but also a professional bent as well. So I have a mixture of both.
So as you kind of mentioned there, Eamon was one of your students, I think, at one point, and you said he was kind of a tech genius then as well when you started.
He was fabulous.
Not sure about that part.
And I taught some of the tutorials for you, and I certainly learned an awful lot during that period. One of the things you encouraged the students to do was to watch the film Temple Grandin.
Oh yeah, Temple Grandin is amazing. She's fantastic. If you don't know her, check her out. She's an American woman, if you're from a rural background, you'll like her because she's great about cattle. She invented a special cattle crush to support treating cattle. And she is an autistic woman who talks very strong and proudly about her own experiences and the ways in which autistic people need to have their own voice. And a lot of this is the research that's been done on autism, very much done by white European men, I suppose, who had very much this idea of lack of people not being capable, a very paternalistic approach to working with people who are autistic. You'll note that I use the words autistic. Some people use the phrases with autism, but I take my lead from the autistic community who prefer to use those terms, autistic, because I'm not saying this is something I should be ashamed of. This is actually something that is part of me, and I should be able to use this term without it being seen negatively. So, working in this area, there is a lot of discussion about terminology. People are often kind of scared sometimes. They say to me, oh God, if I get this wrong. And I don't think there's anything to be scared about. I think if we work with people, not on people, we should, we take our lead from that. That concept of working with, not on, is a key kind of idea from inclusive research. And disabled researchers, in the 1970s in the UK in particular, were very strong in this idea of nothing about us without us. And I feel that this is a great movement that we should be following a lot more in Ireland. I think there is a lot of change that I'm seeing, and that's fantastic. I'd love to see more of it.
Yeah, I remember you talking very much about the nothing about us without us, and kind of participatory as opposed to kind of the researchers on the outside. When I was watching Temple Grandin last night.
You were watching her last night?
I was watching her last night in preparation for meeting you today, and there was some very uncomfortable kind of similarities I saw between myself and her. And
what do you mean uncomfortable now, Dan? Tell us.
Well, I was watching, and I was kind of seeing, the difficulty she's having with loud noises and big crowds of people and stuff. And sometimes when I'm talking to my students about, maybe having to teach autistic people in their classrooms, I kind of tell them about myself going to Dunn's at Christmas. And it's terrible because you have all the Tipperary people that come into Limerick and they don't know what lane to be in. And,
so you mean the West Tipperary people?
The West Tipperary people. And, the frustration is starting to build before you even get there. And then you get in there and you have Mariah Carey and she's All I Want for Christmas on repeat, and all the staff are gone mental from listening to her. And you just want to get in and get out. You put in the headphones, tune everything out, and you just want to buy your food and get in and get out so you can make the dinner. And next thing, what happens? The retail manager has reorganised the customer journey around the shop. So now the stuff isn't where you want it. Now you have to take out the headphones and ask the boy in the shop where the spuds are gone. And next thing you hear, a member of hygiene to Alpha. And, it's all very, very overwhelming. And next thing you just melt and you're a puddle on the floor. So that's kind of my experience of Dunn's at Christmas. And I'm wondering,
that sensory part is so crucial, and we forget about it. And isn't it so interesting? When we think about schools were not designed with this in mind. Even looking at the room we're in right now, looking at the overhead lighting, the harsh lights. Now you gentlemen look lovely in the harsh lights, but I don't. But, these are things that really, really matter, and yet they're so often overlooked. So we talk about doing perhaps a sensory audit of the spaces that we're in, and I think that's a really important thing to think about. How are you going to experience it? Even, the fabric of these chairs that I'm sitting on, how is it going to feel with the fabrics of the clothes that I'm wearing? And you think about, what do we make young people wear? Make them wear ties. And for some young people that can be very uncomfortable. And very distracting. So very hard to concentrate when those sensory issues are distracting you, and also very fatiguing. You mentioned how exhausted you'd feel, and also that change in routine. That really, really matters. A friend of mine gave me an example about her autistic young person who went into class one day and the chairs had been moved around, and he thought that there was nobody in the classroom. So he thought that meant that there was no class on today. So he went home because that made sense to him. And they rang up looking for him. And she said, oh, he went home. He said there was no class. And of course there was class. And he said, oh, but the chairs had been moved around. And he said, yes, but that made such a difference to him. They were like, what? Why? So I think if we have more understanding of those things that might be small, easily changeable things, but they really have a big impact.
Yeah, and that's a major part of it as well. And I often think of, in horror films, where there's been some sort of a gruesome murder.
I'll be honest, I'm more of a Paddington 2 type person. But go on.
But you see in the horror films, and there's a blinking street lamp.
Oh,
and then,
yes.
and then it kind of zooms in slowly, and you see something awful has happened. And that kind of blinking light.
Oh, flickering.
Yeah, and the fluorescent bulb in the classroom, that's flickering.
Oh, and even noises that perhaps you might not hear as the educator or teacher in the room, but the learner may, like, the ticking of a radiator or the ticking of a clock, because a lot of younger people who may be autistic or maybe dyspraxic, they have heightened sensory awareness. So those things can be very, very dominant and can really have an impact on you. But we might not hear it, but the younger person will.
Absolutely. Just on that, and going back to when I was a student of yours, I was thinking about one of the lectures that you gave at the time, and you spoke about learning needs, and that we were kind of reframing the term. It was often looked at as a learning difficulty in the past, but what it is now is a neurodivergent, or it's a specific learning need, I suppose, as opposed to a difficulty. Could you speak a little bit to that? Because I suppose from my perspective, that was one of the biggest learnings from it, from the module. It was like reframing that from being a problem in the classroom to something that we're better off just have a better knowledge about. And there's like a massive amount of advantages to having a neurodivergent student in the classroom as well.
So, thanks so much for sharing that. That's lovely. I suppose I don't want to minimize, difficulties people do experience. I've experienced difficulty with an undiagnosed neurodiversity, and I don't want to minimize the difficulty that society places on people, but that's, I suppose, the crux. The issue is not the person, and I really like reframing neurodiversity in terms of capability. I take this now not to go all social justice on you now, lads, but I'm a big fan of the work of Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen is an economist. But he came up with this theory that's very much used in development work, and now used a lot in disability theory, of the capability approach, and looking at what people are capable of. And if you're neurodivergent, it doesn't mean you're incapable. You are capable. You just might need certain supports to do something. So you might have a learning need in certain areas. So you might need a spelling waiver, for example, or you might need additional time to complete an assignment. Those things don't mean you're incapable. And it's that reframing, I think, that's really crucial for us as educators to think about that because a young fella now is coming in and, forgot his tie in his hours, you're saying, he's a bit of a pain. It's not because that young fella is doing it on purpose. It's because that young fella has some specific needs that need addressing, like support for organisation. Executive functioning skills are often really overlooked. And when we're talking about neurodiversity, I think that's one thing I'd love people to take away with, that understanding of different neurodiversities will all impact things like our working memory, our ability to hold things in our head, remember them and do things with them, So in a kind of a technical context, I suppose you're learning your times tables and things like that. That would be something that would put strain on your working memory. But giving people, orders or, instructions to do something in a classroom, that would put a strain on your working memory. But if you understand working memory and capabilities and learning needs from that kind of more positive reframing, you would know that maybe it might help if I wrote up my instructions on the board and I repeat them verbally and I reiterate them. That will show me as a teacher that I'm kind of reframing my young people's learning needs in a more positive way, a very neuro-affirming way. And I think that's something that's really important, that we affirm, neurodiversity is not lack or something that, is very much missing in a person. It's that sense of the diversity of the human experience. Mm-hmm. And I suppose the other thing that helps us is we look at it maybe from an evolutionary perspective, and that's something that's been used a lot in kind of the research is looking at ADHD, for example, as something that was an evolutionary need. We needed people with ADHD to go out there and check that the saber-toothed tigers were gone. We need that. And people often speak about, the preponderance of neurodiversity in artistic worlds, scientific worlds, that sense of those thinkers outside the box. Often because the box, perhaps, wasn't created for us, so we had to do something different.
And I suppose you mentioned earlier the difficult women with the ADHD.
Why are you looking at me?
And just to kind of let everyone know, special needs are sexist. Boys are more often diagnosed.
Yeah. And this is something I've really come across personally and as a professional, that especially when you're looking at ADHD diagnoses, that, it's very much geared towards boisterous younger boys in the classroom throwing chairs around. But, girls, nice, quiet girls in the corner who are daydreaming, that's often a sign of inattentive ADHD. But those girls go undetected and they mask an awful lot more. And then when you are doing the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, that's often found in the DSM, that diagnostic criteria, people criticize it because they say that it is very much geared towards the male experience. And often we see women try to adapt more to the cultural norms of their societies that they live in. And that issue of masking comes up time and time again. We see this a lot with autistic women. You might have noticed there's been kind of a surge in women getting a diagnosis of ADHD and autism in more recent years. And they say that one of the reasons for that is when COVID hit, a lot of the structures that women had put in place to kind of keep them on track, they couldn't use them anymore because normal life had changed. And it became very much more obvious that the kind of compensatory techniques they put in place, they were realising that they were using them. And I think that we are talking so much more about neurodiversity now, that our awareness helped a lot of women say, oh, maybe I should go get this checked out. Maybe too, these were women who had children who were neurodivergent. And genetics is often overlooked, and we should never overlook genetics. And that genetic kind of component is very important. I was at a conference, the British Dyslexia Association conference in Surrey this summer, and a lot of the research now in neurodiversity is looking at genetics and the impact of genetics on ADHD and neurodivergent profiles. So a lot of those women, anyway, as you said, it can be sexist. I don't really like to use the word special educational needs because I'm somebody with 4 degrees, I speak a couple of languages, I'm neurodivergent. I don't think I have special educational needs. I have specific learning difficulties, perhaps. There are, of course, children with specific educational needs, but I think as you get towards adulthood, I think it's kind of different. It doesn't go away, but it changes.
Yeah, I'm very much getting the moving away from the deficit kind of model that you're advocating. I want to come back to the undiagnosed people in a second, but I want to go back to the sexism for a minute. I want to talk I want to talk about blaming women, and I want to talk about this awful phenomenon of what they used to say was the cause of autism.
Oh, yeah.
The refrigerator mother.
Yes. Well, as we know, then, it's always the mother's fault. And this concept of the refrigerator mother is very common in autism research. And actually, in France, it's still a term that's often used, which shocked me. My first master's was actually in French feminist literature. Not much call for French feminist literature in West Tipperary, I might add. So I retrained.
Madame de Bouvier is not very popular in West Tipperary.
Well, there's a time and a place, but it wasn't perhaps something that was in great demand. But I am someone who has spent quite a bit of time in France, and I was so shocked that this kind of deficit female blaming model was still in place. Now, things are changing, but even if you look at the language that's used in certain countries, it's still a very medical model. And that sense that cold-hearted mothers who didn't show enough affection to their children were the reason that people were autistic has now, of course, been widely debunked. That's Canning's idea of the refrigerator mother. But isn't it interesting that, again, a lot of the people who were making these definitions or doing this research, there wasn't a lot of women involved at the time.
And just how painful that must have been for a lot of women. Like, yes. You're taking, your child, the most important thing in the world, down to the doctor, and you have all these ideas in your head. They're going to grow up, they're going to be a pilot, they're going to do this, they're going to maybe be a lecturer in the University of Limerick, or whatever whatever your hopes and aspirations are for the child. And then you're told they're autistic or whatever it is, and then you're kind of seeking some sort of justification, or why did this happen to my child? And then
it's all your fault. And
then they tell you it's you because you're cold and unloving.
You're a terrible person. Well, then you're a woman. So anyone who's read St. Augustine's views on women is possibly not surprised by this. A lot of the troubles in society are due to women. But this is, let me just say, not a theory I advocate. But of course, this is now changed. And I think we see a lot more women. What's really interesting, particularly in dyslexia research, see a lot of women involved in this, women whose own children were neurodivergent. So I see this in dyspraxia research in particular. There's one researcher when her child was diagnosed with ADHD and dyspraxia, there was nothing out there for him. And this woman was a GP herself, and she thought, I'm going to go and try and change that. So there's been a lot of more people involved in this. Dyslexia, I think, is an interesting one. Anecdotally, I see a lot more women involved in teaching dyslexia.
Why is it so hard to spell?
I know. I suppose that's a very interesting question. I think it just shows how the English language itself is very opaque. They talk about some languages that are more transparent and some languages that are more opaque. So when you think about Spanish or Italian, the sound-symbol correspondence is very easy. The connections are easier to make between the sound and how it's written down. But English is not like that. And I suppose English, as we know, has had, a lot of, 20% of English has French words of French origin. It has had a lot of different impacts and changes. So it's not an easy one. And then, of course, we put down dyslexia. And, I have a PhD in dyslexia and still can't spell it. Always the way.
If we go back to the surgery now, and we've just had the woman who's left the educational psychologist's office, let's call it Dr. Quigley, and she's a refrigerator mother, and she's been sent home to deal with it. Or there's a group of women outside, and you have the mother of the dyslexic child, the mother of the dyspraxic child, and then you have, the child of the gifted mother. Is that kind of different to the other ones? Like,
that's an interesting one.
Well, my kid has trouble, they're autistic, they're dyslexic. Well, my child is gifted.
Well, isn't that such an interesting one? Because, there are people who say that giftedness should also come under the neurodiversity banner. And there's actually a concept of being twice exceptional, or 2E, as often used in the States a lot, because what they have found is a lot of people who are considered gifted, many of them will also be neurodivergent. So there's a very high co-occurrence of autism or ADHD along with giftedness. And I recall myself being in a classroom when I was going out on school placement, and I was in a classroom, and there was a young person there who was very obviously very, very talented, very gifted, getting things really, really quickly. But I noticed how he was moving in the chair. I noticed how he was really needing that kind of sensory feedback. And I chatted to the teachers afterwards, and they said, "Oh, he's very bold." And I thought, that's an interesting one. And I thought that, maybe that this is perhaps a very capable, possibly gifted individual who wasn't being challenged enough, and also was somebody who was experiencing ADHD at the same time. And these are the people that very often do not succeed because they're not given the right supports. I'm off on a tangent now. This is a thing that neurodivergent people often do. But speaking about ADHD, for example, a lot of people in prisons have ADHD. A lot of people in prisons also have dyslexia. And there can be a lot of very talented people in prisons too, But not that I'm saying there's any causation between being dyslexic and going to prison, but isn't it interesting that in the UK, when they did those kind of statistics, which are not available in Ireland, by the way, they said that at least 80%, I think, of the prison population has ADHD or appear to have traits of ADHD. Something very, very high. Now, I could be wrong with the 80%, but something extremely high. And there's also a very extremely high number of people who are dyslexic in prison. So, doesn't that tell a story?
It does. And you were talking a minute ago about people who were undiagnosed with ADHD. And I had noticed a phenomenon of a lot of my colleagues here and a lot of friends of mine who would have kind of advanced degrees, like, and they're being diagnosed with ADHD, and I'm saying to them, perhaps wrongly, perhaps this is coming from an uninformed point of view, but I said, listen, if you have a PhD, how can you say you have a learning difficulty? There's a contradiction in that somewhere. And I mean, I know they're not mutually exclusive, but, for me, I suppose, from an uninformed position, playing devil's advocate here, and I'm saying, look, these kind of things and these teaching strategies are for kind of your more typical kind of teenage boy who's having difficulty in the class.
Well, now.
Killed here now.
Oh no, diminish. But I think that there is, when we talk about ADHD in particular, we associate it with not being able to learn or not being able to focus. People with ADHD can focus. In particular, have you heard of the term hyperfocus?
Yes.
And that concept, if you are really interested in your subject, and psychiatrists will tell you that it's linked to those issues of dopamine receptors in the brain, that if this is kicking off in your brain, you can study on something that really interests you for hours on end. And you could say, oh, that's fantastic, that's brilliant. But the impact of that can be really hard on you physically. You forget to eat, you're not sleeping, you're not exercising. So people may work super, super hard. You may have undiagnosed ADHD and get that PhD, but there can be costs elsewhere. You don't want to, for example, go see my Batman right now. So for things like tidying up, doing that executive functioning in the home, grocery shopping, all of those other things that we need in order to function or to flourish as human beings, that's often something that, we don't think about. So you don't know at what cost that person achieved that PhD. And if you were doing something that you're really interested in, why couldn't you get a PhD in that? You love your subject. And, you can see how it can be of great benefit to you, that ability to focus for hours on end on something that you really love. That's, for doing a PhD in particular, is very helpful.
So apologies there to any of my friends or colleagues who I've gotten that wrong with. I was looking at that film again, and I was looking Temple Grandin. She made a squeeze box that was kind of to give herself a hug.
Yeah, that sensory stuff.
Yeah, and it looked, looked really weird, and kind of it almost looked like a sex thing to her roommates and the other people in the college.
Words I didn't expect to hear today.
Yeah.
But
so in order to kind of keep the box, because she felt she really needed it, she made it a study, and I haven't read the study she submitted, but different people had different preferences in terms of the squeeze box and how long they'd like it to squeeze them from and how they felt and did it calm them. So different people have different preferences, and what the fuck is normal? And will you please tell me I'm normal?
That's the whole point. What is normal? And again, I think that's the whole kind of great benefit that the neurodiversity movement has brought us. That questioning as to what is typical and what is not typical. And, that everybody who is diagnosed as being neurodivergent will have different needs. If you meet one person who's neurodivergent, well, you've met one person who's neurodivergent, There are common traits that people will have, but it's all, you have to remember the interactions of society, culture, our experiences growing up, and, the whole kind of sensory preferences will be all different according to the individual. Have you seen weighted blankets? things like that. They're very popular nowadays, you know. And weighted blankets were, again, typically just the preserve of children with sensory needs who are autistic or dyspraxic. But now everybody talks about them now, and that whole more awareness of our sensory needs, I think, is brilliant. I loved working with occupational therapists, for example, and I think they're fantastic. I think more occupational therapy in schools would be fantastic and would be brilliant for teachers to understand that sensory piece a little bit more.
You mentioned the weighted blankets, and as soon as you said blanket, I thought of my 9-month-old daughter at home.
Oh, yeah.
And I put out the call on Facebook there the other day for a black belt in jiu-jitsu to hold her down when I was changing her nappy, because she's really starting to move at this point. You're kind of an expert by experience in terms of dyspraxia. Do you know when you're doing the baby grow for the first time?
Oh, God.
And
yeah.
little small
buttons. Stop. Yeah. Misery. Yeah. So all of those things, you know, as a parent, you're navigating this and you're going, what's wrong with me? I can't do this. And a lot of undiagnosed people, I think, they just say, I'm just the worst person in the world. I'm a terrible idiot. So for years, I thought I was a terrible idiot. And I still am a bit of an idiot, but now I understand why I'm an idiot, you know. But I think those small, that's a really good example of those kind of tactile stuff that you might find difficult. And that's something dyspraxic people find difficult. You'll note that I use a lot of zips on my boots and things. Don't like tying laces still. Can't tie them, let me say, but don't like doing it, you know. And it's those kind of sensory issues I think we need to understand and adapt for each person.
Just on that, on diagnosis, and I suppose over the last number of years there has been a large rise in the number or percentage of people, I suppose, who have been diagnosed with learning difficulties, be that ADHD, be that any learning difficulty or learning need. What is your view on that? I suppose from my perspective, there's like two viewpoints at the moment. Some would be down to a lot more technology and availability to tests, so we're getting a great insight into the actual amount of people that have it. And from the other side, I suppose there's a view that there's a lot of misdiagnosis going as well. But I don't rightfully know. I'm wondering what's your view on that?
Well, I suppose. Yeah, people say, oh yeah, there's not, we never had that before. We never had autism before. That's such a lie. Of course we did. We just hid people away, or people weren't, you know, able to participate fully in society. In Ireland, we have a long history of institutionalising people. You know, still going on. We still have direct provision centres. So we had a long period where people who were autistic, for example, were often put into institutions. We didn't see them, you know, and our schools weren't adapted. Now, don't get me wrong, there have been some wonderful special schools out there that have done great work, but our mainstream schools weren't, you know, spaces where people could come. I think the work of Steve Silverman and his great book Neurotribes is an interesting read, because he often talks about how in Silicon Valley, a lot more autistic people, you know, got the chance to make a life when they discovered computers and the rise of IT. And then they met other people like them who were also interested in the same kind of areas, and then they got married, and, you know, genetics being what it is, you know, we have a lot more autistic people or neurodivergent people, you know, having the opportunity to live full lives and having children and so on. And that genetic component, I think, is something to think about, that of course we're going to see more people who are autistic or more people who are neurodivergent, because, you know, society's let us live now, you know.
I think there's probably a huge amount of untapped potential in the neurodiverse who can see the world in another way, from another point of view.
Yeah.
That's often been overlooked because it was just kind of written off. And that's the thing as well, you know. Just being written off and being discovered as either an intelligent visual thinker, or I was looking at or in reading Katrina O'Sullivan's book.
Oh, it's not a great book.
She describes growing up, and her parents were both addicts, and she much like Temple Grandin, and she had that one teacher, Professor Carlock, and Katrina O'Sullivan had this teacher, Miss Atkinson, who'd bring her in underpants to change into and all this kind of stuff. So I suppose being discovered as either an intelligent visual thinker or, if you forgive the term, a pissy pank kid who needs a little kindness in some way, we're all terrified of being discovered as who we really are in some way. And but it could lead to, discovering this huge untapped potential. So on that, was there a teacher like that for you?
I was always someone who liked words, and I was very lucky in that I'm not dyslexic, but I always liked words, and I also had teachers who encouraged me to read, who also encouraged languages, and also like languages. But I suppose I suppose a lot of it goes back to my parents too. My parents were teachers; they taught me, and they always encouraged, artistic and creative thinking and a love of the world and looking outside. So I feel I was very lucky in that I had a great primary school education, and weirdly, my parents taught me, but I was very lucky in that. And then I was very lucky when I went to UCC. I studied French and English, and back in the 90s, but that was a great creative space to live in at the time, and Cork was a very interesting place. Cillian Murphy was in one of our cohorts, and we thought he wasn't cool at all. Who's your man tall? Of course, now he's an Oscar winner.
Cork is like Limerick, but more hope, I think.
But what I would say is, however, I was somebody who was able to get by. If I was profoundly dyslexic, I wonder if I would have got through the Leaving Cert. So I think a lot of our educational systems, the mechanisms that we assess people, often write people off. And it's often only later in life that they discover how wonderful they are. I often wonder very much about children in primary school. Get a lot more support for neurodiversity in universities than you do in primary school. And I think that's very, very wrong, because it's at primary school when you're acquiring literacy, you're developing your sense of self, and those early messages can be very, very damaging if they are very negative. And they say sometimes that children with ADHD, by the time they're 12, they would have realized more negative messages than neurotypical kids. And what does that do to you?
You mentioned there Cillian Murphy, the gorgeous film star from Cork. There's a film came out there recently, Kneecap, and the boys are with their Kupla Booma Egan Derashakta, and they're jailed.
We won't do some of them more
but
robust lyrics.
they have the jail tucked Irish because the situation in the north, a lot of people learned Irish in jail. But there's a special, before I even get to that, there's a great line in that film, Gach fucking Gaegar Lauert, Belair dun Sirsha na Hairn. There's a special exemption for Irish for a lot of people who have, a learning need. And I wonder, does that exemption go against the whole point of accommodating people?
I know. I was so shocked when I came back from the UK, because I have children who had to start in the Irish education system, and I have one child who is profoundly dyslexic, but she really likes Irish. She was in kind of more alternative setting, but she learned a lot of spoken Irish. So she's actually great at communicating, and she'll come up and she'll chat away and she'll say, "Call on Banyagas," or but I have another child who is not dyslexic, who has started learning Irish in the more mainstream schools, and he doesn't like it at all because it's very, very boring. But my son is actually very good at languages. It's often the way it's taught. So I was very shocked that for children with dyslexia it was considered, well, you couldn't possibly learn a language. And it really worries me, because you need to speak Irish in order to be a primary school teacher. And to me it means there's a de facto ban on dyslexic people being primary school teachers, which I think is bonkers. Now, I'm not going to say that it's not difficult for people who are profoundly dyslexic to learn another language. It can be. I wonder if there's more of a choice around it. Would that be more helpful? And I'd also say that if we were to think about how we teach Irish, if we taught Irish more like a living language, that would be much easier, I think, for dyslexic people in particular, because often dyslexic people are brilliant communicators.
That's true, and I find with Irish, there's words that are very similar to the English word, but the spelling is all over the
Yeah.
place.
So if there was more understanding of spelling in foreign languages or additional languages for dyslexic people, I wonder would that be more helpful? It doesn't mean that if you're dyslexic you can't learn a language. That's of course not true. Of course you can, but it is going to be a bit more difficult in certain areas. But I think again, if the emphasis was on actually, having a Tianga Bio, having a living language that we speak, even I met yourself now, we had a little couple of focal, and I think it's really important that if we had a whole sea change about how we reframe language learning, how we reframe neurodiversity, that would really help. My own background is actually in languages, and in the UK I was assessing people and I would make recommendations. I think in Ireland I can't do that, my qualification isn't recognised. And I think that it's often psychologists who make this call about languages. Psychologists often do not have a training in languages or linguistics. So I wonder if that's a missing piece of the puzzle there.
So we won't keep you much longer because I know you're busy. But I want to kind of get two more things out. And I've already offended everyone who's recently been diagnosed with ADHD, but I want to further be an advocate for the ignorant and play devil's advocate and talk about a situation. Let's say someone has extreme cerebral palsy and they're going to take part in a PE class, and everyone else in the class loves basketball and they dislike the changes that have to be made to the regular setup to include the person with CP. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not a PE teacher, so it's not. I have to be honest. This isn't my area of expertise, and I think that there's actually a great lot of work done on this here in UL in particular about incorporating disability into the PE classroom. So there would be a lot better place to speak about this than I would. Let me just reiterate my neurodiversity is my thing, but. I think that there's a conversation to be had first and foremost, and it's all about how you frame it. I think just going in and saying, right lads, we're all sitting down doing this now, might be too hard. I think in teaching, it's all about how you present it and you prepare people and you set it up. And I think any good teacher knows how to do that, regardless of what subject they're teaching. So I personally, what I have seen is young people being very interested in wheelchair basketball. Any people that I've seen do this, actually, I haven't seen that issue. And I know that, is it Antonio, that has done a lot of work on this? He'd be the best person to ask about this.
Yeah, and actually, I try that question because it's a very difficult one. Mm-hmm. I share a lot of students with Antonio, so they'd be doing a PME in business and PE. And as soon as I try that on with them, they have like 20 million suggestions. So clearly whatever's going on down there in the BES building is working.
They have really great approaches,
yeah.
And there's a lot of work done on this. So I'm afraid my background isn't in PE, so I can't give you a PE specific recommendation. But those teachers have really been trained on this. And I think they do a special module on this, don't they?
They do. I mean, we spoke about the refrigerator mother. And that was just kind of someone pulled out of their arse, essentially, and likely caused a huge amount of pain to an awful lot of women, not just women, but so that kind of underlines the importance of educational research, and you're very much involved in that. We were talking about languages, and I had a problem trying to study for languages when I was doing my junior and my leaving cert. So my dad got me these tapes by a teacher called Michelle Thomas. You might be familiar with him, but he used to always, at the start of each course he'd do in whatever languages it was, he'd say, there's no such thing as bad students. There are only bad teachers.
Oh.
And I think the indignity, the embarrassment, the disengagement, the humiliation, the school avoidance, the dark sarcasm in the classroom comes from a lack of understanding rather than malevolence or evil on the part of the teacher. So your work in helping teachers not only to understand themselves, but also to help their students understand through UDL and diversification is very important. And thank you for doing it.
Oh, thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Education on the Margins. If you enjoy and are learning from these podcasts, please follow us on all platforms. We'd also greatly appreciate an honest review of the podcast on any of our pod streaming platforms. This is the best way to support our pod. Thank you again for listening, and we look forward to providing even more insights, knowledge, and learning in the next one.